My goodness, what a day of sport. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. This morning, the number one thing was for me to wake up and try and be able to see the France versus Germany third place match in this year's Nations League final. But unfortunately, thanks to the streaming rights here in the US, that idea was quickly bogged down. I then watched what turned out to be, without a doubt, the best tennis match I've ever seen live, the Roland Garros between Carlos Alcaraz and Jannik Sinner, and what was 5.5 hours of pure tennis bliss. But I went into this Nations League final supporting Portugal, supporting Bruno Fernandes, thinking if this game even lived up to half of what I'd just seen between Alcaraz and Sinner, I was in for a great game. Now, before I get into the first half, I want to talk about Roberto Martinez and this kind of lineup that he presented today with Portugal, because it left me honestly quite confused, because he opted to play star CDM João Neves at right back. Now, I'll be the first person to tell you, Nelson Semedo is not a great right back. Diogo Dalot is not a great right back. But if there's one person who has shown so much this season about his potential development of what he could turn into as a number 6, it's João Neves. Since making the move from Benfica to PSG, he's been a seamless transition. He's put up dominant displays in the Champions League, dominant displays in the league. And ultimately, I think he could have done a great job today against Spain and kind of neutralizing this very technical Spanish midfield. But instead, Martinez put Neves in a really unfortunate and unfavored right back side, which to me just made no sense, especially because he had the chance to play him alongside his club teammate Ed Vitinha, another one of the world's best midfielders this season. So it felt like a no-brainer. And I know Semedo and I know Dalot aren't two of the better right backs in the world right now, but it seems like just a no-brainer to take what you can get in Neves and possibly change the game a little bit more into your favor. And Neves wasn't the only questionable decision in my mind. Pedro Neto has been someone that I've long had questions about. And although he got an assist, I'm not quite fooled by that. I think Rafael Leao had a much more productive game, and I know he came on against more tired legs, but ultimately I just feel like Leao would have been able to change the game much sooner from Portugal. But regardless, Portugal ended up getting the win and kind of getting on to that first half. At the end of it, I was a little bit disappointed in both sides, but mostly in Spain, because the most impressive thing about Spain was their defense. I lacked to see a lot of the fluidity and the dynamism that we usually see from this Spanish attack. And instead, it was a really structured and rigid defense, which is good to see, especially under names like Mingueza and Huijsen, players that have almost never played with each other, nonetheless on a national, a cup tie kind of stage. But I think they did really well. I think they neutralized the kind of individualistic style of play that Martinez implanted, with Ronaldo and with Bruno Fernandes, which I'll get on to in a little bit. But as the game kind of ebbed on, I have to give Portugal credit because they held on. I thought to myself, if Spain gets this first goal, it could quickly turn into 2, 3, or 4-0. But Portugal consistently did a good job of kind of keeping things calm and realizing that they could win this game, that they are just a couple plays away from it. And this is kind of where I blame Luis de la Fuente, because a stronger Spanish side would have put this game to bed the second they smelled blood in the water. But the Spanish side just wasn't up to it today, and that's where I think a majority of my blame lies, because I was on by to get into with Roberto Martinez. I don't think he set this game up super well. Roberto Martinez has long been a manager to me who's been a little bit disappointing, kind of what he did with the Belgian national team and kind of what he's doing with Portugal now. I see a very talented group of individuals, but I lack to see a real team structure. It almost feels like it's like, oh, Ronaldo, you're going to eventually get a chance because you're Cristiano Ronaldo. Fernandes, same for you. Same for Nuno Mendes. There lacks a real team cohesiveness that you see so much in Spain. I don't see that with this Portuguese national team. And I do ultimately think that that lies on Roberto Martinez. But thanks to De La Fuente's, maybe the team was just tired today, but thanks to that kind of lack of urgency, it allowed for, Ronaldo to kind of get his scrappy goal, for, individual brilliance from Nuno Mendes, who's been without doubt the best left back in the world this season. It allowed for him to, create his own solo goal, to almost create the second goal, and that's kind of disappoints me from De La Fuente. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it just doesn't really mean that much for Spain, because they're going to be favorites heading into the World Cup. They did their big task in winning the European Championship, but it was disappointing from this team, and it was disappointing from a couple of different players. I know Lamine Yamal got an assist. I believe he was credited with an assist, but I don't think he had that great of a game. He wasn't credited with an assist, my fault. But I remember he kind of created the chance for that first kind of scrappy goal of the match. But I don't think he had that great of a game. I think when we're looking at a future Ballon d'Or winner, certainly a contender for this year, I know it does feel weird for me to hate on a 17-year-old kid, but he's at the point now where he's delivering almost every single game. So he's not just any average 17-year-old. He's one of the world's best players, and deservedly being called that. But I do think today he did disappoint a little bit. Same with Nico Williams. I actually think their striker, Mikhail Oyarzabal, did a fantastic job of holding up play. He got a goal. I remember he did super well against France a couple of days ago. And it's funny because usually the number one possession that Spanish fans or the general public think that Spain needs to improve on is kind of that striker position. But I think they have it really well with Oyarzabal. But it's just the whole entire team seemed to lack the urgency that was needed. And a majority of these players for both Spain and Portugal are playing upwards of 60, 70 games a season. A lot of these players are going to be moving to the Club World Cup in just a matter of days. But overall, from Spain, it just looked like they never moved out of third gear. And it allowed for the brilliance of Nuno Mendes, for the savviness of Cristiano Ronaldo to take advantage of a lackluster Spanish kind of play tonight. One of the last things I wanted to get into was the future of this Portuguese national team. As I mentioned before, you've probably been able to gauge it. I'm not a fan of Roberto Martinez. I don't think he's the right guy to lead this team forward. I think there's only one man who could do that. And it seems obvious, it seems cliche, but it has to be Jose Mourinho. And I'm looking at where Jose Mourinho is right now. He's obviously one of the most respected managers in the world, but right now his reputation isn't in its best place. He's at Fenerbahce, and he was brought in with this demand for him to win the Turkish Super League. He was brought in with the demand for them to compete in Europe. And ultimately, in his first season, neither really happened. And I think he's slowly being moved to the hot seat. Now it's hard at a club like Fenerbahce to fire a man like Jose Mourinho, but I think Fenerbahce fans are quickly losing favor with Mourinho, and he was kind of brought in under their current president and was given these expectations that he was going to succeed, and ultimately he hasn't thus far. And I'm also looking at this Portuguese crop of players. Cristiano Ronaldo's 40 years old. Bruno Fernandes has hit his peak and is probably slowly ebbing away. Same with Bernardo Silva. Ruben Dias is coming towards his peak. I'm looking at a lot of the spine of this Portuguese midfield, and I'm thinking to myself, this next World Cup in 2026 is probably their last chance to really vie for silverware, and I don't want them to risk that with Martinez. I think it could just be. I think it happened with Roberto Martinez, in all honesty. With Jose Mourinho. I think if they brought him in, he could help reinvigorate this side, because today they didn't win because they were the better team. They won because Spain was almost the worst team. I know that's a harsh thing to say, but that really is, especially kind of when I'm thinking back to certain sequences of the game. That's kind of how it felt. It felt like Spain kind of took their foot off the necks of Portugal. And when it hits the 2026 World Cup, that's not going to be able to happen. When they're playing against the likes of England, of Germany, of France, of possibly Spain, again, Brazil, these teams are going to be dying for this trophy. And, if they come under this with Roberto Martinez, I'm afraid that they're going to be playing the same way in which they play today, which is too risky in my eyes. So I think it's time for them to move on. I think it's time to move on, even into more of maybe of a pragmatic system under Jose Mourinho. I think it could help some of these players. I'm looking at Gonzalo Inacio, who I don't necessarily think is some world-class defender right now. If you give him tight spaces to play, though, like any solid defender, he should be able to do his job. I think the roles under Jose Mourinho, while are physically demanding, are relatively easy to do once you learn it in his kind of style. And that's why I think he's been so successful, especially in cup ties, especially in knockout tournaments. I mean, he is debatably the knockout king up there with the likes of Carlo Ancelotti. So to bring him in for this one last tournament with this one last golden generation, I know that term's used a lot, but I do think it's true with this Portuguese team. To do it with this golden generation, it just feels right. So ultimately, I am a big proponent of moving in Jose Mourinho, letting Roberto Martinez go on a high note. I mean, winning a cup with an international team is never anything to kind of hate on. So Roberto Martinez would be leaving this as a winner. But it's time for him to move on, bring in Jose Mourinho, and hopefully see magic at the 2026 World Cup. Guys, let me know your thoughts. I appreciate you all sticking with me, kind of hearing my thoughts about the game today. Let me know your thoughts if I got anything wrong. Like I said, disappointed in Spain, but I know they'll be back in the future. But thank you all for all the continued support, and I'll see you guys later. God bless.